Good morning, afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Trevor Sharon. I am the president-elect. I've been part of the CCA for a long time, like since 2017, I think was the first conference I came to. And one of the things that I think is really cool and something that continues to grow and to grow in the CCA is the reason to be a member. And I think it's not just events like this, it is the communication that we're able to provide as an association to all of us who are busy, who may or may not be super connected or barely connected to what the state's doing or what ACA is doing or the nation or any of it. And being able to see behind the scenes, there are a lot of people in our state who are just incredible resources to us as therapists. And I think the association does a really good job of involving those people and highlighting those people. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited that we have Khara Crosthwaite-Brindle, because she is a huge resource for this state, for every counselor. She is a prolific author, which is the word that I think they give you if you publish 8 books in 6 years. Yeah. She's a great speaker. And one of the things that I think sets her apart too is that she's producing enough content and enough resources for all of us that she could easily take just about any question we could have and say, go buy this book of mine, go watch this video of mine, go to this website area of mine. But very rarely do I ever hear her say that. Most of the time, she's more than willing to give an answer and has become known, as I found out from Stephanie, somewhere in this room, she's the go-to person for a lot of the Medicaid stuff that's happening right now too, and not looking to, pull your arm to give you the information, but just wants to give the information and is more than willing. And so I hope that all of you will take a moment. Her booth is right there in the corner. You should meet her if you haven't already, and you should thank her for coming, and you should thank her for what she's doing, even if you haven't been impacted. And you can start by doing that now as she comes up to give us our keynote.
I don't do podiums, so I'm down here. Hopefully y'all can still see me. Hi. There are not enough words to tell you how sorry I am for your loss. I'm thinking of you. There are not enough words to tell you what this feels like, but I'm going to try. My name is Khara, and I'm a confidential grief specialist. What the heck is that? My journey is a rocky one. You're going to hear a lot about me today as to why I became a confidential grief specialist. But first, we have to understand confidential grief. How many of you before today, raise your hand, heard of confidential grief before? Like 5 of you. Yeah. Some of you read my book. Confidential grief was coined by Dr. Lena Stalpetro. She said, confidential grief is the experience we have when we lose a client to suicide and we cannot talk about it. Why? Because it's confidential in the sense of its client work, but also, more important to this group, it's confidential because of the stigma that is attached to client suicide. We don't feel like we can talk about it freely without judgment, without our colleagues having thoughts or feelings about that work. I stand in front of you as Trevor said, prolific author, but more importantly, as a therapist survivor. I have had a client die by suicide. It has not been that long since she died. And yet I want to talk about this. I want to crack open confidential grief and say, we don't have a purpose for this. This is hurting us. This isn't helping us in any way. The only thing it's doing is isolating us, making us question if we should be in the field, making us wonder, what could I have done differently? Making us burn out. The average counselor stays in our field 7 years. I'm going to repeat that. The average counselor stays in this profession for 7 years. What are you doing?
microphone. I'm giving you another one.
Come on.
It's not coming across really well. Good point, by the way.
Fine. Way to ruin the moment, Ryan. No, I was kidding. It's okay. Y'all needed to take a breath, right? Like, that was a lot. Average clinician, 7 years in the field, confidential grief is a thing. My invitation to all of you is I want you to expand this definition. Today, we're not talking about confidential grief just from client suicide. We're talking about all the things in our profession that feel secretive. Things that I lovingly call the big 5 fears of our careers. Things like a subpoena, a grievance, client-directed violence towards us, client suicide, and client sudden death. I am not unique in having some of those big 5 fears in our careers. I've been in the field 14 years. I plan to stay, but there are times in my journey where I questioned if I should be a therapist, which is what I want to share with you as to why I do what I do now. So now y'all know what confidential grief is. 5 of you knew it before now all of you know it. So let's talk about my journey. Buckle up, you're not gonna be able to fall asleep after this lunch because we got all sorts of stuff we gotta unpack. The first time I questioned if I wanted to be a therapist was a couple months into graduate school. The picture you see up here is a couple months into graduate school. I'm a 23-year-old green clinician, fresh-faced, eager to be here, University of Denver. These are some of my peers in my cohort. I distinctly remember a class in career counseling. Some of you are gonna have like a trauma reaction, career counseling, where we're talking about the Myers-Briggs personality test. In this dimly lit room with this blue PowerPoint, all these people were chattering and excited about their personality type. I wanted to shrink. I wanted to hide. In my cohort of 22 people, I was one of 2 people who tested as an introvert. And my first thought was, am I not supposed to be a therapist? Now your faces tell me an answer I didn't have at the time. But I thought that there was something wrong with me. In my cohort, there were just 2 of us, and we were quiet, we were observant, we were reserved. Were we not supposed to be therapists? The first seed of doubt was planted then, 2 months into graduate school. Not yet confidential grief, but some doubt. This is me graduating from my master's program. 2 years in, 24 and a half or so. This almost didn't happen. About 8 months into my internship, my 2 supervisors sat me down for what I thought was a normal supervision session. I want you to imagine a cubicle with the horrible fluorescent lights. There's no door, and we're doing supervision. Any red flags happening for this group? Already not great. And I'm looking around and I'm going, why does this feel serious? My gut is saying something's off here. Now I see it in my head as if it was an intervention. In this cubicle with no door, behind this massive desk, sat my 2 supervisors, and they said, Khara, we have concerns. I'm like, oh God, what? What are you concerned about? Am I not doing right by my clients? Is there more I need to learn? I'm here to learn. I'm here 4 days a week. What more do I need to do? Khara, you're too composed. Khara, you're too stoic. What? I was sitting there trying to shrink yet again inside of myself, withdrawing, going, what is wrong with me? Why am I not a good therapist? They finally told me what they really wanted, which is, Khara, I want you to cry. I want you to cry on command right now in front of us. What? Your faces, I needed you back then. What the right? I sat there in front of my leadership and didn't know what to say. I was like, I'm a grad student. I am in an internship. I don't know what to do with this information. Instead of crying on command, which is what they wanted, I retreated inside of myself. And at that point, my shame monster was born. Now, you all might have had a shame monster before this. I'm sure I did too. But that's when I started to call it what it was, which was I felt shame. What's wrong? What's wrong with me? Why don't I belong in this profession? The confidential grief part of this is I felt like I couldn't tell anyone what had just happened with my 2 leaders. I felt like I just had to pretend like everything was fine. When my gut said, this is wrong. This is a boundary violation. This is not okay. You are not my therapist, you are my supervisor. But I didn't have the authority to say that then. So instead, I retreated inside of myself, and my shame monster said, you are not good enough to be in this profession. Now, spoiler alert, obviously I graduated. This picture wouldn't exist, and there's a reason that happened, and there's more to that story. But that was in a situation where I couldn't go back to my peers and talk about it. It's too much shame, too much confidential grief. Could not say this, because what if they were right? What if I wasn't meant to be a therapist? To make matters worse, 2 weeks later, they said, Khara, you didn't cry for us. They didn't say that. But they said, we're not going to sign off on your hours. You are not ready. So they said the very thing I'd been saying to myself for 2 weeks, wondering if they were right. I know now this is leadership trauma. This is what I call that, leadership trauma. Defined as being betrayed, burned, questioned, made to think like you were less than by someone in a position of power, your supervisor, your leader, your manager, your boss. Now I can talk about leadership trauma all day, but then I didn't know what that was. A month after I graduated, I was again under some horrible fluorescent lights. Not a fan. This time I looked sickly. I was pale, I was shaking. I was sitting in my part-time job, wondering if I was gonna be able to keep it together. Because that morning I woke up to horrible, horrible news. That morning, we all woke up to horrible news. In that moment, I was trying not to throw up because I'd had my second of 2 migraines that I've ever had in my life, sitting at my desk. My boss is like, just do you, it's gonna be fine, check your phone. It's all I wanted to do was look at my phone. Because that morning, somebody propped open a door, went into a theater, and opened fire. Why was this happening? Why Colorado? I'd been here 2 years. Why was this happening to my community? More importantly, it felt super close to home. I was looking at my phone waiting for an answer. I knew that 4 of my friends were in that theater. I was waiting to see if they were alive. By that afternoon, I got the news. 3 of them were out, alive, and traumatized. 1 of them had died. 1 of them had been killed. He, Alex, was one of the 12 killed. I hadn't gotten my first real job, and I was sitting there going, I don't know if I can do this. How can I be a therapist holding this space for others when someone I know personally was just killed in this mass shooting? How am I supposed to hold it together and stay stoic and composed when all I wanted to do was hide? This felt like confidential grief too. It wasn't something I could go talk to my colleagues about. I could talk to my cohort. That's who you see on screen. But I couldn't talk to anyone else about it. And like so many of us here in our profession, we have to stay strong. We have to just keep going. And that was the message I was getting as a brand new green clinician who'd graduated the month before. I'm gonna invite you all to take a breath because you're holding your breath right now. The worst is yet to come. Our shame monsters carry confidential grief. You might call it your inner critic instead of shame monster. It serves the same purpose. Confidential grief and shame thrive in darkness, thrive in isolation, thrive in secrecy. That's how they live. So here I am bearing some of my most intimate, vulnerable experiences as a clinician to show you what it's like to combat confidential grief, to speak my truth and have it not be so hard. Could I have done this in a moment? No. But years later, I can. If you are comfortable, I want you to think about something your shame monster would say to you. Because there's stuff that they're gonna say, right? It's an inner voice that most of us have. If you're comfortable, put your eyes at rest or close them for just a moment and envision your shame monster for me. What do they look like? What are they doing? Are they a person, place, or thing? What are they saying to you right now? Notice how that feels. I want you now to envision a container to put that shame monster in. Surprise, EMDR container, IFS parts work, woo! Go ahead and put that shame monster in that container for a moment. Tell it, I don't need your help. You might be trying to protect me and I do not need your help. Put it in that container. Is it in? Close the lid. Is anyone willing and comfortable to share with me what your shame monster looked like before I show you mine? Anyone have an image that came up really vibrant? Yeah, Kellyanne. If you want to, or I can just repeat it. You're not afraid.
No. So my shame monster is something very unique. It is a claymation item that is very much years of it. And it's always morphed. Basically very sharp teeth, very dirty mouth, and it looks like it's very tired with yellow eyes. And it always likes to transition, and it always looks ragged. That is my shame monster. And that has been with me probably for the last 15 years.
No, well, what's your container?
Actually, you guys are gonna laugh. It is a gooey, sticky, old jam jar.
Gooey, sticky old jam jar. I like it.
You can tell I do parts work.
Thank you. Anybody else want to tell me what you saw? Shame monster, or even just your container if that feels safer. In the way back. Yep. It's you. Your shame monster looks just like you. What'd you put him in? Tupperware. That's my favorite. Every time I do this exercise with clients, it's almost like 80% Tupperware. I love it. Anyone else have Tupperware? No? No? Obviously, when you do this with your clients, you get all sorts of containers. You get treasure chests and shipping containers and baskets and boxes and all sorts of things. Because we're just trying to get some space from that shame. We're trying to breathe again around that shame. My shame monster looks like a giant thumb crushing me into the concrete. That's what mine looks like. I couldn't do the AI image I really wanted. Someone needs to educate me on this. I'm an elder millennial. This is not my thing. So this is your image. But when I check in with my shame monster, it's really trying to keep me small. It's trying to keep me quiet. It's saying you're failing at things. Stay quiet. Don't tell anyone you're failing. Which I know, again, I'm not unique in that dialogue. Fast forward a couple years, I got a job, community mental health. This is Jamie, one of my closest colleagues. I've known her for a long time. She and I were hired in community mental health at the same time, and our trajectories look pretty similar. We worked for several years. We were promoted into supervisor roles. We went into private practice, and so forth. We're still very close. She is somebody that is my professional executor of my will because she knows my client base, and I trust her. Different conversation, professional wills, you all should have one. I picked this picture because this is me coming out of professional burnout. I'm pale, I'm always pale. I'm puffy, might always be puffy. My hair is falling out, it's brittle, I'm having eczema outbreaks. I'm going through what actually ended up being 2 years of burnout before I recognized it for what it was. Sheer stubbornness. This is stress. This is fine. I'm fine. I think of the dog in the house on fire. I'm fine. Everyone's fine. My burnout took 2 years before I decided to tackle it, before I said, I have a problem. In that 2 years, there was a period where every day I fantasized about quitting my business, getting on a plane, and starting over. Significant mood swings. Another interesting sign of burnout, road rage. Maybe some of you are feeling seen right now. Road rage. What got me out of my own burnout was people like Jamie, but I was functioning fine. That's what I told myself. I was functioning fine. I asked some of my longest clients after I got out of burnout, which took about a year, I asked them what I was like then. What was the work like for you? Khara, you were great. You were awesome. You were so dependable. You showed up every time. You were here. While on the inside, I felt like a shell of a human. I gave my clients everything, and I was a shell of a human when I got home. I spent 14 or 16-hour days with my clients, came home and wanted to talk to no one, including my spouse. This is my spouse. He doesn't get on social media, so I'm not sure how I feel about this. Look at the way he looks at me. He married me in the middle of my professional burnout. He loved me at my worst. He is my biggest champion. Try not to get emotional. He looked at me one day and he said, Khara, I see you 7 hours a week. You work for yourself now. Do you think you'll change your schedule? Oh, I thought I was fine. I'm doing fine. I'm doing great. That innocent question pushed me into my burnout recovery. It wasn't my medical crisis. It wasn't my health stuff. It wasn't the clients. It was him saying, I see you 7 hours a week. Can you change that? And as a stubborn perfectionist, Enneagram 3, I do that for him because I wasn't going to do it for myself. I see you, Enneagram 1s and 3s. We'll talk about that later. The hardest story to tell you is this last one, and then I promise you it gets a little lighter from here. As Barbara's taking a breath. My spouse was there for me amidst my colleagues when my client died by suicide. I wrote her story, I wrote my story in one of the books back there in the booth. I knew I would write about her as soon as she died. Her story is interesting, her story is heartbreaking, and I knew that I had to make meaning out of that to survive it. My client died in 2021. I'd been working with her for 3 or 4 years before that. She's one of those clients that when you look at them, you get a gut reaction as she's gonna be the one. She's gonna be the one that dies. If you've not had that experience, I'm happy for you. But I looked at her and I was like, you're gonna be it. She was so blunt, she was so real about her suicidal thoughts. And she's like, Khara, I'm so tired of fighting. I don't wanna do this. And then lo and behold, almost all of her protective factors were obliterated in a week. And that was it for her. Now, she took me along for that ride. She said, I'm going to tell you everything that I'm thinking. I've got a plan, I've got a date, but I'm not going to tell you that date. I got a lot of consultation in that month saying, what do I do with this? She is so real, she's so blunt. The morning she didn't check in, I realized she didn't check in, and I said, oh no. She had told me when she decided to die that her phone would be turned off. When she didn't check in, we were scaling her suicidal thoughts every single day. I called her, straight to voicemail. My stomach dropped. I started to cry. I was like, this is it. She told me this is exactly how this would happen. Even as my brain was trying to convince me that she just broke her phone. It fell in the toilet. She's gonna call me from some other phone and be like, I'm so sorry. This isn't happening. That phone call didn't come. Instead, I texted and called her several times throughout the day. I tried to focus on my other clients as I had her in the back of my mind. And then I did a welfare check, which amounted to nothing. The police called me back, no disturbance, nothing going on. We didn't decide to go in. That's it? That's all you can do for me. I'm telling you, she lives alone, and you're not gonna go in the house. At that point, my spouse comes down the stairs and sees me rage crying about that news. What's wrong? I'll be damned if I let her rot in there alone. That's what I said to him. I went to bed. I tried to convince myself this was just gonna be fine, and the next day she was gonna call me, she was gonna apologize. Instead, I got the voicemail. Hi, Khara, this is the neighbor. She left your phone number, she left her name. She's died by suicide. I found her today when I went into her space. I immediately call this woman back, and I'm in therapist mode hard. I am trying to help her. She just found someone who's been in their house for possibly 2 to 3 days after they died by suicide. And she's given me all the grisly details I don't need in my confidential grief. But I'm doing my best to hold for her. About 30 minutes later, I've wrapped up that call. I immediately think of my colleagues who've been trusting enough to tell me this has happened to them. I try and call 2 of them. One of them doesn't answer, the other's like, I'll text you as soon as I'm done with session. He has no idea why I'm calling him. A third person I call is Jamie, who you just saw on screen. She answers, she can barely understand me. I'm sobbing so hard. Khara, what is it? She's dead. She's died. My client has died by suicide. I am part of a statistic. The statistic that says 1 in 4 of us as counselors will have a client die by suicide. From the data I've collected, it looks more like 1 in 2 of you in our state will have this happen. Jamie doesn't have lived experience with suicide, but she does her best to hold for me as I'm trying to get the words out. I find myself saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I realize I'm not apologizing to Jamie, I'm apologizing to my client because she's already gone. Within 24 hours, I'm writing out my client's story. I want to make meaning of what just happened. This feels like a bad dream. And yet, outside of those 3 people that I called, there's no one else I'm telling that this happened. Because I'm already having those thoughts of, I messed up. What did I miss? How could this happen to this client? I'm a bad therapist. My shame monster and my confidential grief are super loud. That thumb is crushing me into the ground, saying, you will never speak about this. Even though I knew in my hearts of hearts I wanted to. I just didn't know who was safe. This is a month after my client died. I'm a twin. This is my sister and I. What you can't see is that I'm pale with dark circles. My hair is still falling out, not from burnout this time, but from grief. From this life-altering event that is client suicide that so many of us might experience at some point. Okay, you can breathe now. That was the hardest part. The things I've learned from these experiences are what make me a good clinician, make me a good supervisor, make me a leader, make me a consultant. It's what made me a confidential grief specialist is I want to talk about this. I didn't know who to go to outside of those 3 people, and I didn't want to put this only on their shoulders. I wanted more. So here are some things I've learned from all of these experiences so far. The first, which some of you are going to be relieved that I come back to, introversion is okay and welcome. Raise your hand if you're an introvert in this room. Where were you in 2010? It took getting into my full community to realize that I was not an anomaly, that introverts are great clinicians, that introversion is part of our superpowers. I had to get to know my community to know that to be true because I was sitting in a room with one other introvert going, well, what's wrong with me? Now, as a mental health leader, I consider introversion one of my superpowers amidst, surprisingly, perfectionism and vulnerability, which is what we're up here doing right now. That was the first thing I learned. This picture is about a year out of burnout recovery. Someone snapped this picture of me at a restaurant. I don't know why, but there's something in the eyes of this version of me that reminds me that introversion is okay, that to protect yourself from being burnt out, to be an introvert is okay. She looks tired. She looks super serious, right? But there's something in her that reminds me this is okay to do. This is okay to be an introvert, even as we're healing from confidential grief. Second thing I learned, vulnerability is allowed in leadership. I'd just gone through my 20s being told, you're too stoic, you're too composed. Khara, why don't you cry? Performance crying, is that a thing? Not for me. I've cried more in my 30s than I ever did in my 20s. Probably for the first 3 decades. Hormones, I swear, and having a kid. But vulnerability is allowed in leadership. This was not an easy thing to learn for me. Confidential grief and my shame monster said, this is not something you do. You do not tell people where you failed. You do not tell people where you messed up. You do not bear this vulnerability to others without the risk of being harmed in some way for doing that. I learned this in 2 ways. In 2019, I was selected to be part of a mini MBA program. I was flown out to Boston. I did 4 months of work. Some of you know the 10,000 Small Business Program because a lot of therapists have now joined those cohorts. It's an awesome opportunity. The first time I embraced vulnerability was the day that we all came together, 50 entrepreneurs, and they said, we're going to talk about money. How'd that land for you? If you had a somatic response, I hear you, I see you, I felt that. Irony, I'm a financial therapist now. But in this moment, in 2019, you couldn't drag me into a room to talk about money, to talk about our business, to talk about our numbers. And I was like, I woke up that day and I said, I do not want to go. I'm going to hide in my hotel room and I'm not going to do this. But something inside of me said, you just need to tell people how you're feeling. My little 7-person cohort, none of them are therapists except me. I went to them and I said, I am not going to show up well. I'm going to show up as my angry teenage part. I might cuss you out. I'm going to cross my arms. I'm going to have a resting bitch face. And I might just disengage from this whole thing. And I said, Khara, that's okay. You take whatever time you need. This is a hard module to handle. We're all entrepreneurs. We're all small business owners. We don't know what we're doing. We don't expect this to be fun. I was like, wow. Here are a group of non-clinical professionals being like, you are okay the way you are. You can show up any way you need to. Maybe don't cuss us out, but the rest is fine. From that experience, I was able to go further into vulnerability in this cohort. At the end of the 4 months, we had to pitch our business in 3 minutes to a room of 50 entrepreneurs. We had to talk about the business, what we wanted, how they could support us. Everyone was all about numbers. I was going to talk about suicide prevention and training, which I've been doing for the last 9 years. I made a decision based on that small cohort reaction of you are okay as you are to show up in vulnerability with them, all 50 of them. I made my pitch. I had my voice wavering. I felt like I was going to cry. My legs were shaking. And I still pitched suicide prevention to this group of people who came up after saying, that was amazing. I will remember you. How can I help? What can I do to support your cause? That's when it clicked. Vulnerability in leadership is allowed. It's okay. I immediately ran from the room. My nervous system could not handle anymore. Tempting to do after this. But I went out and did a brisk walk, changed my clothes, posted this picture on the right to my community, and I said, I get it now. Vulnerability is not a bad thing. I can allow myself to show up fully, and it can make a difference. My community is like, yeah, Khara, hello. But I had to figure that out for myself. From this pitch, we had to go then select one person out of the 50 to pitch to a group of 100 entrepreneurs. They picked me. I went through the self-torture again of pitching the same day, 6 hours later, still shaking, still wanting to cry, maybe wanted to throw up a little bit. Did it again, won the entire pitch contest with my story. From there forward, I knew that vulnerability had a place in my life. I didn't have to be the stoic 23-year-old who didn't want to cry on command. There was a time and place for that. I took that vulnerability into the first book I ever wrote, of 8 books, as Trevor said, in 2019. I wrote probably the safest book I could have wrote, which was on supervision. I created the empowerment model of supervision with a colleague. Now, after the leadership trauma of my internship, what happened there? For those of you who are like, cliffhanger, what happened? My mentor at the University of Denver, I went to her, I cried with her, and she said, what? They're holding your hours hostage because you won't cry for your clinical supervisors? Guess what she did? She paid them a little visit. She went to the site without me. I don't know what was said. But lo and behold, my hours were signed. My evaluations looked great because I had been doing good work up until then. She believed in me before I believed in me. From that leadership trauma, my first job, Christina, who you see here, was my supervisor. The first question she asked me, Khara, what do you look for in a supervisor? What? What do I look for in a supervisor? I have no idea. I've had 3 supervisors at this point in my young career. I don't know what I want, but can I tell you what I don't want? Yes, she said. Yes, you can. She handled all of the things I said. Please don't be my therapist. Please don't violate this boundary. Please let me show you that I can do the work. Done. Christina promoted me to a supervisor 2 years into the field. I had 15 green clinicians under me. I started doing suicide assessment trainings. Years later, she comes back to me and says, Khara, you're a great supervisor. We have to write a book about this. Are you sure? My shame monster wanted to be like, no, I don't think so. But then in vulnerability, I decided to share my story every time we did a training on this book. Every time I named my leadership trauma, somebody else felt welcomed to share. Somebody else said, that was me too. That was my experience. Third thing I learned, stories eliminate isolation. All of you have stories. All of you have gifts that you're giving your peers, your colleagues, your supervisees. Stories matter. I decided to embrace my author identity in 2020. I wrote a book on workaholism. I shared my burnout journey of how I got there. It was perfectly timed for a pandemic where all of us backslid into workaholism, working 14 hours a day. And then I was selected to do a TED Talk on this topic in 2021. Again, I had to stand in front of almost 300 people and say, here's my story. Here's what I learned. Talk about vulnerability. I am 7 months pregnant in this picture with my daughter. She is a TEDx speaker. So not only was it vulnerability of my story, it was the vulnerability of, please don't kick me in the diaphragm while I'm talking to 300 people for 10 minutes, which she didn't, thank goodness. But that felt more possible in 2021 than it ever had. If someone had asked me to do that in 2018, when I was still in burnout, in 2019, when I was recovering, not an option. Too much confidential grief, too much shame. All of these experiences allowed me to write my client's story of suicide, which is the book I wrote this year. I'd drafted it, I'd held on to it, I wasn't ready to write it. I wrote her story, I did not write mine. Mine wasn't done yet. It's still not done. Every time I thought about this speech, I cried. I'm doing good right now. Good. Every book I wrote got more and more vulnerable in my lived experience, and this one felt like it took the cake. There was no hiding that my client had died. There was no hiding I felt responsible. There was also a lot of healing and ideas I had for our community of how not to harm us further. This is when I found the term confidential grief. I was researching for my book and I was like, what is this experience? And someone said, this is confidential grief. What is that? We've defined it, we've lived it. This feels awful. And yet stories eliminate isolation. So we're here talking about how to combat confidential grief. You know what it is. You know why I'm a confidential grief specialist. There are 3 things I think that could help all of us as a community to combat it. Because again, I'm not unique. There are plenty of people, this is going to be their story. The first thing, which we've heard a lot from our speakers today, build your community. Some of my community are here. Some of you I'm just getting to know. My colleague, Alex Castor-Croy, we do a lot of things together. He calls this his soul tribe. Who are your people? I call it, who can you be real with? Who can you ugly cry with? Who can you have a vulnerable text exchange with? Who can you ask, hey, hold up this mirror. How am I doing? How am I looking? Someone who's going to tell you, there's something there you might need to work on, but without feeding your shame monster, without making you feel awful about it. Who is in your community that you trust to get real with? Some of mine are here. Alex, Liliana, Jen, Stephanie, here in the back. Wave, Stephanie. She holds up my mirror a lot for me when I ask her to. Jamie is here. So many colleagues. I don't have pictures with all of them, nor do you need to know every single one of them. But it is a privilege to have people I can be myself with. They were the rehearsal to stand here in front of you, to say that was okay. This is safe to do. So the question and the invitation is build your community. Who are your people? Private practice is isolating. We celebrate going into private practice and we are alone in the field. If we're lucky, we're part of a group practice where we have people down the hall, but so many of us are solo practice owners with nobody there. Who is our community? How will that combat your confidential grief? Second thing, I heard this morning when we talked about Gen Z and supervising Gen Z, awesome presentation, by the way, show up. Show up authentically. Show up in your realness. So many of the speakers here at this conference are showing up for you, doing amazing work, sharing what they're doing, talking about it, presenting on it. My community showed up for me in all of these horrible experiences that you've heard about today. My DU mentor showed up when those people said, "You are not a good clinician, we're not signing off on your hours." My community showed up when Alex Teves died. They protected our cohort at the memorial from a radical group that was there for the media coverage. My community showed up in my burnout by saying, "Teach me how you got out of this. Thank you for sharing your story." My community showed up when I called my friends, my colleagues, and said, "My client has died. I am part of that statistic. I am part of your community now." How will you show up in authenticity and being real? I took the showing up to another level outside of this keynote. Last month, Alex and I decided to do a leadership trauma healing retreat. We said, you know what? The more we talk to our community, the more we own our stuff, the more we hear that leadership trauma is happening. I've been thinking about this for years. I just didn't know how it was going to work. And then all of a sudden, we had 12 clinicians come with us to the beautiful West Cliff, Colorado, to a beautiful, peaceful place. And we showed up, and they showed up. It is easily one of the top 5 things I'm proud of in my career so far, of how amazing those people healed and connected and grew together. So the question is, how do you want to show up? Is it creating healing spaces, which is the last thing that might help us combat confidential grief? Create spaces for healing. Is this a consult group? Is this a group practice? Is this a retreat? Is it a conference? Is it group therapy? Where are the spaces people are healing? We hold a lot of stuff for our clients as clinicians. We are not perfect, nor should we be. So where are we healing from all the things that have happened? All of the confidential grief, all of the secrecy. I cannot make mistakes. I'm a clinician. I have to be put together. I have to be healthy. Burnout would say otherwise, and yet we look so functional to people who don't know what they're looking at. Some of my favorite healing creative spaces, I talked about my leadership trauma retreat. I've talked about workaholism. I talk about money and mental health and therapists and their avoidance with money. You're my people. I started there. I'm also writing workshops for therapists to tell their story, to make meaning of some of the things they've been through. It has been one of the most rewarding things I've done this year, to bring therapists together and hear about the books they have in their head and help them put them on paper. So the invitation for all of you is, where are you finding healing spaces? Where are you creating healing spaces? You are leaders in this field. There is more we can do to combat confidential grief. Final thoughts. In our field, we love the analogy of planting seeds. Y'all have heard this probably for years. Grad school, carrier planting seeds. You won't always see them grow. Well, that sounds disappointing. I don't get to see them grow. I'm working so hard. It'll be about 10 years. You might hear from a client in 10 years. That's really disappointing. I invite you all to think of this as a reframe. Imagine it as breadcrumbs. We are leaving breadcrumbs for people for when they need them. Breadcrumbs are small, they're digestible. We are allowing people to come closer by putting our hand out and saying, I have something for you when you're ready. When you are ready to come closer and to connect with me, it is here. That's for our clients, that's for this community. Trevor mentioned, I didn't know what he was going to say, by the way. Trevor mentioned that I have lots of things. Those are my breadcrumbs. Those are the things I felt called to create to help my community heal from my lived experience. This was not a fun experience to go through, but I wouldn't change it for how it showed up in my leadership today. So where are you leaving breadcrumbs? Are you showing up? Are you building community? Are you creating healing spaces? There are not enough words to tell you how sorry I am for your loss. There are not enough words to tell you how grateful I am to talk about this. There are not enough words But because we're combating confidential grief, we're sure as hell gonna try. Thank you.